gathered here in this little kinder gym for an incredible opportunity to learn more about both Montessori and the value of early learning. We are so proud tonight to have on our panel one of our very own Montessorians, as well as 3 nationally recognized figures, 2 of whom were parents at our school. Our moderator for the evening is a 4-time Gladwyne parent, Michael Smerconish, who is a radio host for Sirius XM and has his own Saturday program on CNN. Gerry Hartnett has been an elementary teacher at Gladwyne Montessori for more years than she will say. No. And is an expert on the Montessori method. Dr. Stephen Hughes is an internationally renowned, I've got to get this right, pediatric neuropsychologist and chair of the International Montessori Association's Global Research Committee. And after 34 years of public service, including 24 as an elected official, Governor Rendell literally needs no introduction. Today, he is an MSNBC commentator. He continues to be an advocate for many of the same issues that he was passionate about while serving, and he's been a Gladwyne Montessori parent and grandparent. This evening is a testament not only to the quality of education and the kind of families who choose Gladwyne Montessori, but to the future of our school. Please enjoy, engage, stay for the reception. There's lots of great food. And when we leave here, please continue the conversation. Thank you.
Now the hot topics are 21st century learning skills. And a lot of the 21st century learning skills that are coming out in workshops and presentations and articles, the main thoughts, the main philosophy, a lot of the points are coming from what Maria Montessori originally said 100 years ago.
Our approach lends itself towards children wanting to learn. And once you have the motivation for wanting to learn, and before you know it, the ideal classroom falls into place. Montessori education is an opportunity for children to learn, to love to learn how to fit in the larger community or the world when they get older. And that idea of that global community, that we're all here together, we all have basic needs, desires, I think is something that they'll take with them.
Contemporary neuroscience tells us that a child's learning is largely dependent on interest, emotional engagement, social interaction, physical activity, and the accomplishment of mastery. In a Montessori classroom, students are not asked to sit still and listen. They are provided interactive, hands-on manipulatives instead of textbooks. They have uninterrupted blocks of time to master their work and have opportunities for collaborative learning.
We don't know what our children are going to be able to do. We don't know if the way technology is moving will take us into areas that we can't even imagine now.
Jobs are changing profoundly. Our kids will not have the kinds of conventional careers many of us or our parents may have had. Law, medicine, engineering, accounting, all of those careers are being fundamentally disrupted. What our kids will have, if we are fortunate and work hard, is a set of opportunities. And the question is, will they have the skill and the will to seize those opportunities or to create their own opportunities?
Governor, two tours of duty as mayor, 2 as governor of the Commonwealth, but did you ever sit in a chair like that?
No. I assume we put 4 or 5 kids in this chair at once.
Can we talk about the politics that surround early access and pre-K? And my question is the value of early learning still subject to debate, or is the debate about something else?
No, it is sadly still subject to debate. How many of you in the audience think we live in the greatest country in the world? Raise your hand. Well, we do because of our values and the incredible amount of freedom that we have, unparalleled on the face of the planet. But if anybody thinks we're the greatest country in the world because of our achievement, we're not anymore. We used to be, but of the 39 nations that sign on to an international test in science and math for high school students, we finished 21st in math and 27th in science. 21st in math and 27th in science. We don't value education. We say we do, we talk all about it, but we don't value education. You asked that question, it reminds me of a story, Michael. The National Governors Association was out in, actually there was the Democratic Governors Association, was out in Phoenix, Arizona. Janet Napolitano, who was then governor of Arizona, later became Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama, and now is the chancellor at the University of California. She was the governor, and she was wrapped in a fight with her legislature. And the newspaper that morning, we got up on a Saturday morning, the newspaper said, Speaker of the House, who happened to be a Republican, but there are some Democrats who don't get it either. Speaker of the House said, full-day kindergarten is absolutely unnecessary. And we had a little bit of a press conference, and I said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard out of the mouth of an elected official. There's no question. Education is like many other fields. There's a science to it, and the science is driven by research. And research makes it absolutely clear that kids learn at 6 months, but they especially learn as 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. Those are the years when you build a foundation. And just like when you're building a building, if the foundation isn't good and strong, nothing else matters. Study after study shows the value of quality pre-K education. Study after study shows the value of full-day kindergarten. In fact, nothing is more impactful in closing the gap between majority students and minority students than full-day kindergarten. There's a great study in a suburban Maryland county that establishes that. And yet politicians don't want to spend the money to make it happen. Let me just tell you, and I'll conclude, Michael, by telling you this one last story. My first year as governor, I found when I became governor-elect, the same thing Governor-elect Wolf is finding, I found that I had I was inheriting a $2.4 billion budget deficit. I had 5 weeks to craft a budget. So there was no doubt in my mind the only way, we have a constitutional requirement in Pennsylvania for a balanced budget. The only way we were going to do that was to raise the state income tax. We were out of the 42 states that have state income taxes, we were the second lowest. And we raised it, after we raised it, we were the third lowest in the nation. So we raised the income tax, but I also had a report commissioned by Governor Schweiker. Marilyn Lewis and Morris Gerber from Equitable and from American Water had chaired this study on early childhood learning. And it found that Pennsylvania was only one of 9 states that gave not one nickel to pre-kindergarten learning, not one nickel. So I was bound and determined in my first year to put $500 million into pre-K. Pre-K, full-day kindergarten, smaller class sizes, after-school tutoring. Well, the legislature was so resistant to that. They knew they had to raise taxes to get rid of the deficit, but they were so resistant to raising taxes a little bit more to deal with pre-K and full-day kindergarten that we didn't have an education budget. We're supposed to have it by June 30th. We didn't have it that year, as you remember, Michael, till December 21st. And finally, we had dug our heels in. We compromised on $330 million. But even today, with that great start, it's been cut back, and we spend about a fifth of what the average state spends on pre-K education. There's a program that advocates have started called Pre-K PA, And it's dedicated to convince the new governor and the legislature to fund absolute universal pre-K for 4-year-olds, which isn't enough. We should be doing something for 3-year-olds. But 4-year-olds would be a good start. Governor Schweiker and I went around the state to drum up support. We're still doing that. It's absolutely essential. Look, Jesse was fortunate to come here as a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. And he was ready for kindergarten like you wouldn't believe. I'm sure some of your own children have gone through that experience. Jesse actually not only was reading like a champ, but he knew a little Spanish. Probably not enough to get by in the barrio, but he knew a little Spanish entering into kindergarten. And he was cooking. His socialization skills were good. His cognitive skills had been developed. And I thought, what a sin it is that most kids in Pennsylvania don't have any pre-K learning, go to 2 or 3 hours of kindergarten at most, and we had to change it. And we did, but over the last 4 years, we've rolled back a lot. We've got a lot of work to do, and one of the reasons I came tonight was try to persuade you to talk to the suburban Republicans, mostly Republicans, and tell them that this is an issue that you're going to vote on. That pre-K is so important to our development as a country, as a community, as a region, as a city, that this is an issue that you're going to vote on, and you want to see them raise their hand and vote for pre-K education.
I'll just underscore the governor's commitment by saying that he gave up a date with John Bon Jovi to be truly to be here tonight. So
The Marian Anderson Award tonight.
To his credit, we thank him for that.
Well done.
Dr. Hughes, in your experience, what are the biggest detriments to widespread access to early learning?
Well, I think the governor hit on some of this. The science couldn't be more clear on this. Now the question is, does what happens in education, is what happens in education actually based upon what we know about scientific research? And it's been my experience that it isn't necessarily, that it really comes down to policymakers, elected officials who have opinions about things, who are speaking to constituents who maybe they want to say what they want, the constituents want to hear. I don't know. It does not seem like science necessarily guides policy. I'm interested in your thoughts on that, actually. How does it or does it not, or does it depend?
Well, when you consider that about 53% of the Congress of the United States doesn't believe there's global warming, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence, how in Lord's name are we going to convince them that pre-K is absolutely essential? No, they're deniers when it comes to global warming, and there are people like the Speaker of the Arizona State House who don't believe it matters. Their answer to everything is, well, the parents can teach them at home. Well, yeah, but how many parents are at home at 3 o'clock anymore? Even if you've got a 2-parent family that's intact, they both work most of the time, and they're not around, and they can't do the same things. And a lot of kids don't have 2 parents, and a lot of kids may have 1 parent who works hard and is exhausted by the time she or he gets home and can't do the job. And besides, parents aren't trained. They don't know the things that you know. And hopefully one of the things we're doing is, and I know we do here, is tell parents what to do when the kids aren't in school, but you can't rely on the parents alone. We have to, when Hillary Clinton said it takes a village to raise a child, she probably shouldn't have put it that way, but it actually does. It actually does.
Well, maybe the community here at Gladwyne Montessori doesn't have to wait until the state decides to do something for the underprivileged children who would like to be in a kindergarten or pre-kindergarten program. I mean, when you think about the plans that we have for ourselves and all the development that we have already done within our school, I think it's time we start thinking about how do we reach out to the larger community. Beyond Gladwyne, beyond our little network of parents and friends. We have a wealth of teachers here with a lot of experience. And I really think as a community here at school, we could begin to think about, well, what can we do to help solve this problem? It may be a small help, but at least we know we have the power to maybe change some little child's life. If some of us would get together and think about maybe a satellite school or think about funding for a Montessori program for children who are underprivileged, maybe not bring them out here to Gladwyne, but to go where the need is. So I think as people who are lovers of Gladwyne and understand Montessori, think about how we can develop some little program to start things going instead of waiting for maybe the state.
In the city, for example?
In the city, for example. If you wait for the state, it may never happen.
No, you're absolutely right. And you should do that. And one of the reasons after Montessori school, Jesse went to Penn Charter and was a lifer at Penn Charter. We had investigated it and found that Penn Charter had a student body where 38% of the students get significant financial aid. So there was a good mix. And that diversity helped Jesse, as he was growing up, be acclimated to all sorts of different people and different social values and mores. It was a tremendous experience. But in the end, and what you're saying is right, and if you could do that, it would be a godsend. Even if it's 5 or 6 kids, it's a start. But in the end, we may not like the government. It's fashionable to beat up on the government. But in the end, the only body that has the ability to make pre-K universal in Pennsylvania is the legislature and the governor.
Gerry, what's so special about the Montessori method for early learning? I confess, I'm one of those parents, and I did it 4 times over. I know better the machinations of the turning circle than what goes on inside here. You know, we pull up, it was nurturing, it was warm, it had Ann Schwarz. What the hell you were doing inside, I have no idea. All I know is that at the end of the day, I had happy kids and they were productive. So take us in here and tell us what's so special.
Well, I think what's so special is that if you think about the curriculum that we use was developed by Marie Montessori, a doctor herself who studied and observed children. And that's how she designed the program that she came up with. She watched them to find out what it is they need. How do they react to certain situations? And around that, she developed all these pieces of material to help children learn, because she found out even the children who perhaps had a bad background or came from a low-income family, they still wanted to learn things. And so as she watched them, she carefully developed things for young children. And I think you've seen studies about how all the things that she did has now been proven to be so helpful in the development of children's brains, and that it is a necessary thing that these children be exposed to certain kind of learning activities very young for them to develop their full potential. So I think that's what makes us so special, that we're interested in following the child and helping him develop. We don't think when they come through the door that we have an empty glass and here's another opportunity to fill it with what we know. We kind of see the child as an opportunity for us to help the child experience his love of learning. And I think that's probably part of the problem that the governor was talking about, the low math test scores and the low science test scores. Children don't love what they're doing, and it's just like us. If you don't love what you're doing, you maybe do it half-heartedly. And I think that that's part of why our children are so successful, because they love what they're doing, and we're doing it in a way that's part of their growth and development. And again, we're not filling them with book knowledge that we know. We're helping them go out and discover what it is that they want to learn, and I think that's why they're so happy.
Steve, to the extent that people look at this school located in Gladwyne in the heart of the main line and think that it's a methodology that works for kids of privilege, what I've just heard from Gerry Hartnett is, oh no, it cuts across all denominations.
Oh yeah, without question. I mean, it's just fascinating. So she developed this approach, this facilitated developmental approach to education, working with what are amounted to street kids, living, kind of hanging out on the streets in Rome while their parents were doing factory work or things like that. This stuff is really universal. I was just in Australia last month, and there's an indigenous group in Australia who lives in a region called the Torres Strait. It's that body of water between the pointy part, Cape York, that pointy part of Australia and Papua New Guinea. You see that on a map. It's the Torres Strait. And this is an indigenous group that actually descends from South Seas Islanders. And they are having the experience, they've had the experience that sort of every indigenous group has. They have not done well after, encountering colonialism and the West. It's the same thing everywhere in the world. And, hundreds of millions of dollars, thousands of human hours have been squandered, really, trying to make traditional education work in that region. And it doesn't. It never has. In fact, it doesn't work on most Indian reservations for the most part. It doesn't work with people who are disadvantaged in this particular way because there's not a cultural relevance to it. And a pilot study was done with Montessori. And as a consequence of that experience, now they're rolling out Montessori throughout all the 17 islands that they live on in that region. In fact, nothing has ever worked. And so they have all the problems that you can just, visualize what it's like, It's hard. It's desperately hard. And they've embraced Montessori as the only thing that's ever worked for their community. So now they have 0 to 3 Montessori programs on most of the islands. They have 3 to 6 programs on a couple of islands now. And I was just there for like a big summit, People came from all the outer islands to one of the more centrally located ones. And it was a 2 or maybe 3-day conference about how Montessori is instilling hope for like the first time in generations, is instilling hope for the survival of that language, that culture, for that way of life, and really that people. And Gerry, this wouldn't surprise you one bit. It wouldn't surprise you one bit. Because it happens that way with East Dallas Community School, which, for example, it's a community where there's about a 50% high school graduation rate in East Dallas, except for the kids who attend Montessori, who attend East Dallas Community School. And they just attend through 3rd grade, okay? So it's early childhood through 3rd grade. They have a 97% high school graduation rate. 9 years later, they leave Montessori and they go on to the regular school system. And those kids graduate high school, 97% high school or GED, like 2% GED. The rest are all regular diplomas. And almost 90% go on to post-secondary education. And those are children who are from a community that has a less than or about a 50% high school graduation rate more generally. Now we see the same thing in Minnesota, where I'm from. The Montessori Center of Minnesota is providing technical assistance and training for teachers from, right now I believe there's 5 of what will ultimately be 10 community-based world-class Montessori schools serving children from disadvantaged communities, okay? And maybe there's 6 right now. We're doing a program evaluation. We're finding that to a remarkable degree, Montessori for disadvantaged children essentially erases the achievement gap. It's not just, Governor, your point about early childhood is really important. I think we have 2 things that we have to happen, and I can imagine the level that you're looking at this. One is we've got to get support for early childhood. Absolutely. It's got to be universal support for early childhood. The economic case for that is absolutely made. The second thing we got to do is we got to get quality early childhood. So let's get early childhood in there first, and then let's get the kind of quality early childhood that makes a profound difference in outcomes.
Yeah, that's a very important point that the doctor just made. You can't just have essentially glorified childcare. It has to be a rich educational experience. And to follow up what you said, Gerry, the key in learning, it seems to me, is to get things that kids can get excited about. We had a science program that Bayer Aspirin actually sponsored. It was about science for 3rd graders. And we put it in as a pilot program in public schools and some private and parochial schools in Pennsylvania. And I went to see it, and the kids, the 3rd graders, were learning how rain is created. And they didn't have a textbook, they had a workbook, and they did experiments. 4 kids at a table, and they did experiments. This experiment, they got one of those things we put in the refrigerator with the lids that are airtight, and inside the container, the teacher put dry ice. And on top of the container, the teacher put a warmer. And as the warm air came down and met the cold air, it started to rain inside the containers. Now, those kids will never forget how rain is made. If they heard it from a textbook with a teacher standing at a blackboard, they'd forget it an hour later. We put technology in every high school. We put laptops in every high school classroom in Pennsylvania for the 4 basic subjects. And the kids can't take the laptops out of school, but they use them there. The teachers have smart boards, and the teachers teach off the smart boards, and the kids problem solve on the laptops. Every school reported that the entire tenor of high school classes had changed. They went from kids falling asleep or throwing spitballs at each other to kids that were truly engaged because they were doing something that they knew and they liked, using computers to solve problems. That's the key to education, as it's the key to, as you said, Gerry, to anything we do.
Well, that's
I
to
mean,
answer Michael's question. He knew his children were happy. That's why his children were happy. They were doing
things they like.
things with their hands.
I mean, I think that I've been a success in politics because I like people, I like talking to people, I like interacting to people. The only politician I ever saw who didn't exactly enjoy that was a friend of Michael's and I, was Arnold Specter, who persevered, even though I never got the feeling that he actually liked it very much, but he persevered.
Governor, where Tom Wolf is saying he's going to expand early access for 3- and 4-year-olds, and hearing all the peace, love, and understanding that we agree with about Montessori, is there a Montessori role? Should more elected officials, should your successor, I guess 2 or 3 times removed, should he be looking at introducing Montessori into a public curriculum for 3- and 4-year-olds?
Well, sure. One of the things we did when we got the money for this early childhood efforts was we gave the school districts the ability to contract out to providers, either private providers or nonprofit providers. So a school district could contract with Montessori. The biggest problem is the actual space, because most schools don't have space. They have space for kindergarten, maybe, and 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade. They don't have space. So I think about 80% of the money that was allocated for 4-year-old pre-K was contracted out. Montessori could have a role in that. Montessori could certainly come in and teach some of the other nonprofits some of the best methods. There's no question about that. But I don't think it has to be done necessarily at the school district level. In fact, sometimes it may be better not to do it in the school district itself.
Yeah, boy, or what? Yeah, or what? Seriously. Because we're in a different kind of business than content.
Right.
And school, traditional school is oriented around content. Our natural allies, and there's a problem, if I may say, there's a problem with asking the schools to bring Montessori in. This isn't their thing. We're not really in the school business. We're in the human development business. And you'd think that schools would be in the human development business, but they're really not. They're in the content transmission business. They come out of a framework where teaching is telling. And so the example that you shared, Governor, about computers, for example, that's a great example of how to make telling work better. Let's find interesting, innovative, new ways to tell. But in every generation, there's been new technology. When I was in 4th grade, it was film strips. That was the new way of telling. Okay, so yeah, sure. Let's appropriately adapt technology and let's augment telling. But I think the real problem is our natural allies in Montessori are not really in the traditional education world. Our natural allies are in the neurosciences, because they are the people who do developmental cognitive neuroscience research are very interested in how to build better brains, okay? And it's been my experience that people working in traditional education, they don't oppose that, but their whole ethos is about a teacher-led, very content-driven experience. And while there certainly is content, and they do need to learn and write, and to read and write, it's abundantly clear that so many of the benefits that come out of Montessori actually come out of maturation of really significant and meaningful aspects of cognition. It's not about the content. In fact, if it is only about the content, or if it's mostly about the content, you can't do the things that lead to the development of self-regulation or executive functioning more generally, the development of concentration through maturation of the task-positive neural networks. This stuff is really an important distinction to make. Yeah. So it's not going to happen. I don't think that we're going to get our inroad into traditional education by saying, we too do school. Because we're actually doing something different, and I would argue something that has a more meaningful impact for kind of lifetime outcomes.
Is part of the problem that there's a testing mentality that has gone overboard? Wow, and Montessori doesn't lend itself to that?
Oh, without question, without question. You probably have seen this emerge during your years in the public life, but think about this. There's only one basic framework for education that is about testing. That's the teacher-led, content-driven framework, okay? Well, that's just one way to do school. You could argue that there are 4 sort of general pedagogical frameworks. There's the teacher-led structured curriculum. There's teacher-led unstructured curriculum, very project-based, okay? Project-based education, very different outcomes, very different goals. You've got student-centered education, where the teacher is a colleague or a partner with the students. There is no curriculum. You have facilitated developmental, which is where Montessori resides. Only one framework is all about teaching to the test. And you know what? In general, teaching to the test seems like the way to get the best test scores. But let's think about the outcomes that student-centered really want. They're talking about wide-scope development. So is the So is the facilitated developmental. But because we're not all about the test scores, the fact that we as a society have decided that education should only be about the test scores, it acts to delegitimize all these other ways of doing school that actually, and kind of ironically, have the wide scope development of the human being as their more intended purpose. But if you're doing stuff like, like inventing a small business, you're not spending time teaching to the test, okay? So in that project-based or that student-centered environment, when they're doing things that you would hear about, we'd all hear about and say, wow, that sounds really neat. Why can't they do more of that kind of stuff at school? Generating small businesses, getting things, inventions patented. The reason they can't do more of that stuff is because their jobs depend upon performance on standardized tests. Okay, you guys follow me with that? So when it's all about the testing, you can't do the things that are absolutely legitimate ways to do school, but different. And maybe don't tend to produce the big test scores. They'll certainly produce good enough test scores, but if you're, if the only thing that matters is performance on high stakes, standardized achievement tests, that the research is abundantly clear. It narrows the curriculum, it makes teachers do more teaching as telling, and it eliminates stuff that, that isn't about the test. Stuff like band and choir and art and even recess. Even as we know that exercise has a significant impact both on cognitive development and also on achievement, on tests. But people get scared, people get scared about the testing. You want to say something to that, Gerry?
I did because I hear what you're saying and I agree with you, and it seems like it's a large problem. But I think I would like to kind of whittle it down and say, well, what can we do? What can Gladwyne Montessori do in a small way? And there used to be what we called the Teachers Network Association, where we brought in teachers from surrounding schools here to Gladwyne, and we used to meet monthly, and we would talk about the way we taught, the things that we taught, how we did it. They would discuss the things that they did. It was kind of a sharing, and I'm wondering if you can't somehow get into the public schools, but sort of start a network with teachers so that even though you're a teacher and you have fourth grade, you have diverse abilities in that fourth grade, similar to what I have in 6 to 9-year-olds. So why can't we somehow reach out to some of these teachers that are in the public school and talk to them about, well, this is how we do creative writing. Or this is the way we encourage the children to read through science. Or I think that I agree there is a big problem, and I don't know where the answer is and how soon you could ever get an answer. But there's some of us that don't want to sit and wait. So I think that if we could get a group going to kind of reach out, even if it was just in, I'm sure somebody in this audience has a connection somewhere in some public school in Philadelphia where the children are needy. And there's a teacher struggling with the 25 children she has in front of you. In front of her. Why can't we somehow make a connection? I think if we take baby steps to do something like that, we're doing as much as we can do. The governor, he's trying to do what he can do, but we can't wait. I think we should start out marching and do a little bit to reach outside of what we're doing ourselves here at Gladwyne, because we do it so well.
You've raised a couple of really good examples of, Gladwyne is a well-developed, strong, mature, and continuing to mature program. So, once you've reached this level, and it's like, okay, we got our game together. Yeah, we've got our game together. We've got intellectual resources in this community. So what's the next move? And I think that it's really exciting to talk about taking a leadership position in the broader community. This business about having like a satellite school, maybe a satellite school that's designed to serve more disadvantaged children, try to gain, improve access. Well, that model exists. There are people doing that to great success. There are people that you could network with to help. And it really is exceptional what can happen if you do that.
I think as a Montessori, we'd like to think of ourselves as, like the hub, right, at least on the East Coast, because there is nowhere, as far as getting trained Montessori teachers for elementary, you have to leave the state, and they have to go live outside the state. Wouldn't it be great if we could begin to train teachers here? Right. Yeah. Once you get a group of teachers trained, then you can begin to do things, reach out to other communities. So I think, and I know we've talked about it amongst the administrative staff and the parents of the school about, we would like to be a training center. Well, I think we can do more than just one thing. We can also begin to reach out to other teachers in other scenarios. And I know the teachers on this faculty here would be more than happy to do so, and they have a lot of expertise. And yeah, I
And then when
agree.
you've got that example out there, then people start agitating for getting some more of that. Why can't we have
Why
that
can't
in
we
our
do it?
public schools? I think that there's a problem that people don't actually know what we're talking about when we're talking about Montessori.
I agree with you.
But if
because
we get
even-
some powerful examples out there, people say, well, wait a minute, that's working for them.
Well, even when you go to college to get your degree in teaching, there's one paragraph in the textbooks that they use on Maria Montessori.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you're training teachers, and they've never even, they've never heard it except for
Right.
one paragraph.
In
So-
fact, they may think
so
that the only way to be a teacher is to be in a teacher-led, content-driven environment. They
think so.
can't conceive of anything else.
No.
Governor, three quick questions for you. Are you running for mayor in 2015?
Give me all the other two.
I thought I could catch you off guard and you'd give me an answer and we'd have it on tape. Is Hillary running in 2016?
Give me the third question.
Third question. Why does the term educational reform seem to be a permanent part of our vocabulary?
No kidding.
No, yes, and it's because we.
Okay.
It's because we've never had a sustained effort. And I will say, Gerry, I want to correct you in one sense. I think people may not intuitively know what the best methods are, but I think people do care about education. I mean, all you have to do is look at the Pennsylvania election. Tom Wolf is a very decent man. He ran great ads that showed how likable he was and his achievements. But I would submit to you the reason that Pennsylvania absolutely went against the national wave and Tom Wolf won by 10 points was not because of Tom Wolf, although he ran a very nice campaign and is a very likable man, and I think he'll be a good governor, but was because people had made a judgment on Tom Corbett devaluing education in his first year in office. I went around to the polls on Election Day, as I've done for 34 years, and people would come up to me as they were going to vote and said, I've been waiting 3 years to cast this vote. Well, no one who knew who Tom Wolf was 3 years ago. They were coming in to vote against Tom Corbett because they thought he had devalued education. And in fact, that was, by and large, a correct reading. The problem with America is that there doesn't seem to be sustained growth if one governor pushes an educational agenda. It's only good if the commitment is made to continue it. And if the commitment is made, well, we can't afford it. Those programs that Governor Rendell started, they may or may not work, but we can't afford them, so we're going to defund them. That's what's put us in a position where we're almost, not quite at square one, because we still give about $160 million a year to pre-K education now. But 8 years ago, it was $330 million. So we're not back to square one, but we've rolled it back. So there's got to be continuity. North Carolina did a very good job in bolstering its public education, and it's been a very productive state in public education because a governor by the name of Jim Hunt served for 8 years, advanced the cause of education. There was a governor who came in after Jim Hunt, also advanced the cause of education. Then Jim Hunt came back and served for another 8 years and continued to advance the cause of education. So we're always reforming because we take 2 steps forward, and if we're lucky, only 1 step back. What we need to do is take 2 steps forward, 2 steps forward, 2 steps forward, 2 steps forward, and we'll get there. And we also have to have a commitment. I would assume, Gerry, and my guess is that the teachers here at Montessori School don't get paid as well as some of the public school teachers. They're here because they love what they do. No. They're here because same thing at Penn Charter. They're here because they love what they do. They want to teach. They love the interaction. They love the freedom they have. They love the method. But we as a whole don't value teachers. We say we do. We hate the teachers' unions, but we say we love teachers, but we don't value teachers. I will give, and no one up here can answer this question, but anybody in the audience, I will give you 4 tickets to the next 76ers championship basketball game. Admittedly, you have to be young to get this. If you can answer the question, in those tests that I talked about, one country came in first in math and first in science. Anybody know which country it was? Yes, ma'am. China, no. What was it? Singapore, no. Sweden, close. Finland. Finland pays its teachers comparable salaries to what they would get in the private sector. So a science teacher in high school in Finland makes the same starting out as an engineer does working for an engineering company in Finland.
It goes even deeper than that. In fact, my partner's Finnish.
Oh, there you go.
She was a teacher in Finland, and then she went and trained in London to learn Montessori education, and now she's a Montessori teacher trainer. So
in Finland?
No, she lives in London.
In London.
Tell me what that's like. I live in Minnesota. Yeah.
Well,
anyway,
go ahead.
I want to interrupt you, but it is fascinating because, in fact, this was a deliberate effort to absolutely change education in Finland. It began over 40 years ago. It began with a national commitment to fairness of access to high-quality education opportunities. So they said, we're going to change education in Finland to make sure that it's based upon equality of opportunity for education. So every school in Finland is a fabulous school. In fact, I was in Finland with her doing a workshop for Finnish Montessori teachers, and holy smokes, it's like, wow, this is a public school? It was the most well-outfitted, most beautiful learning environment I had ever been in, with the exception of some very high-end independent schools. Secondly, those teachers, you're right, they are paid well, they are treated as professionals, and in fact, to get access to teacher training, you've got to be in the top 10% of the undergraduate population, okay? So it's hard to get into a teacher, can you imagine what it would be like to say, in America, it's hard to get into a teacher training college? Because it ain't, you know? It's the other end. And the third thing I'll say, Governor, the third thing I'm going to say is that they are treated like professionals. The curriculum that they have to work from, when my partner was a teacher, the curriculum was like 3 pages of suggested content. 3 pages. Work off of this sort of thing. This is the idea, these kinds of things. But you know, you're a professional, and you're bright, and you're well-trained, and you know about human development as well as, you know, teaching. So yeah, this is what we recommend. But you know, you invent it yourself. So that means education is a developmental profession for teachers who, by the way, are drawn from the highest ranks of the undergraduate population. Though, so the point I want to make is that, I just happen to know something about this. You know, I just happen to know about this, yeah. But seriously, they made a national commitment to absolutely change how they do school. And now education reform is not part of the conversation in Finland. In fact, when they get those PISA rankings, this is the standard, the international testing the governor's referencing, when they get those PISA rankings, whether they're number 1 or number 2 or number 3, they say, yeah, but you know, we got a good thing going. Let's not mess it up.
Absolutely. Should we give the doctor 4 tickets to the next one?
No,
I'm going to play lightning round with Gerry Hartnett in a moment. Okay. But I want to ask a follow-up to the governor, because you spoke of the political potency of the education issue, and I was going to ask you how you thought it impacted the election of Tom Wolf. Evaluate the politics of the Common Core, because it seems like that now is the lightning rod, politically speaking, in the educational realm.
The Common Core is, in my judgment, going to stop us from having 2 terrific candidates for president. Believe it or not, and people say, oh, this is the best the country can do, the 2 best candidates for president in terms of being a good president, in my judgment, would be Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush. But Jeb Bush will not win the Republican nomination because of something called Common Core that Michael referred to. When Jeb Bush was governor of Florida, I was in my first term as governor of Pennsylvania when he was in his second term in Florida. He developed standardized testing that every Florida student would have to pass before they could graduate from high school. So there was a way of bringing rigor to high school education. And he asked governors around the country to sign on to Common Core. And interestingly, there are 55 governors, counting the territories. And I think 54 governors signed on when Jeb Bush sent it around. This was in the middle of the last decade, 2004, 2005. Now, for some reason, the conservative right wing of the Republican Party has glommed on to, this is Washington telling us how to educate our kids, and that decision should be made by local school districts, not by Washington, D.C. Well, in truth, it wasn't Washington. It was 55 separate governors in 55 separate states, including the states that they're from, signing on. Now all these governors are running for the hills. Governors who signed on to Common Core are now saying they don't want to do it. In Pennsylvania, I signed. Governor Corbett commissioned a study of Common Core because he was getting ready to withdraw us from the Common Core community. So I think it's going to have an effect. And Common Core was just what Jeb Bush was trying to do, and what we all agreed with was there should be rigor. We hand out high school diplomas. You know, you hear graduation rates are getting better in the U.S. Well, hopefully they're getting better in part because we're doing a better job educating our kids. But in part, they get better because you don't have to do much to graduate in many school districts. And as a result, you're unprepared for anything. You're unprepared for college. You're unprepared for junior college. You're unprepared for work. You're unprepared for, you can't be a building tradesman. You should see the test that an apprentice plumber or an apprentice carpenter or an apprentice sheet metal worker has to pass. You've got to understand computers. You've got to understand word processing. It's unbelievable. And we're graduating kids that are not prepared to do anything. They are DOA. And this was an effort by Jeb Bush and by all of us to change it. And now it's become a huge political football. And I believe it will. I don't know whether Jeb Bush will run. He might not, because he has a sense that these things are going to crop up and bite him. And he actually has a reasonable position on immigration, which may be death in the Republican primary. So I'm not sure he will run. But if he does, I think Common Core will be his Achilles heel.
Lightning round for Gerry Hartnett. 5 quick questions, relatively brief answers. You ready?
Ready.
You're nervous. There's been no screening of these questions. I
don't give you my age.
I get how younger students would benefit from being, they're all Montessori focused.
Okay.
I get how younger students would benefit from being grouped with older students. My 3-year-old with someone else's 5-year-old, for example, and the mentoring that might result. What's in it for the 5-year-old?
What's in it for the 5-year-old? Well, the 5-year-old begins to become the teacher for the 3-year-olds and the 4-year-olds. So all the skills that he has developed as he's been going through the process, he can now help the younger children. Whereas, again, it reinforces the skills that maybe he started to learn and you need a little more practice. It's a great way for children to practice things that they need to learn. If you ramp it up a little and you say, well, you know, the elementary children need to know certain facts in math, but they don't want to sit down and memorize them. But if that 3rd grade person or that 5-year-old takes those flashcards, and maybe he's got a 4-year-old that can do some addition flashcards, it helps him reinforce his own learning. Besides, it builds within the child, I think, self-esteem.
Number 2, isn't 3 too soon?
Is 3 too soon? I would say probably not in this day and age. When my daughter was 3, I thought it was too soon, but that was a different age at that time. But I think at this point in the development of children, I think there's so much known about how good it is to be in school at 3. I think it's a good thing for 3-year-olds to be.
The impression among some outside the Montessori system is that this is a completely unstructured world. Is that true or false?
It's totally false. It's very structured. In fact, one of the main tenets of Maria Montessori's philosophy is children thrive on structure. So when you give a lesson, you have certain routine, a certain pattern to follow to give the lesson. So it is very structured. And then it's unstructured because the children have the ability to make choices. And so they thrive within the structure of the curriculum that's being delivered. They thrive in the ability to have an environment where they can make choices in that curriculum. So that's...
Without standardized tests, question 4, how are you able to chart progress?
Well, it's part of our training, and also, again, part of Maria Montessori's philosophy is observation, observation, observation. If you spend a lot of time watching someone, and I would suggest maybe you go home and watch one of your boys, you will learn so much about that child that he's never going to tell you, and B, once you learn how the child acts, thinks, supports himself, then you know what his interests are. And then you can keep him interested in his work by knowing the child better. So observation, and talking to him, having a conversation about, well, you know, let's sit down and I want you to talk to me about, I see you have the right answer, but how did you get it? You know, I see you're stuck on this particular problem. What's your problem with that? And as they explain that, you begin to understand how he thinks. And I know I've told you the story about Lucky. In talking to Lucky, I found out the way Lucky learns because Lucky told me, I need to work by myself. That's how I learn best. So if I didn't do observations on children and if I didn't sit down and have conversations, then I wouldn't know. So I know what somebody knows because I observe, I talk, I listen, and we do give little tests here and there. Just, it's sort of a life skill.
Finally, question 5, and this is one that I hear from, let's say, radio listeners who would call me on something like this. It all sounds rather anti-competitive. And so their argument goes, there will come a time when they have to learn hard lessons, and you have so nurtured and protected them in this environment that you are forestalling the lessons of the real world.
I think competition is so strongly, what shall I say, born when the children are born. I mean, our children are competitive. The environment may not be a competitive environment, but there's a natural competitiveness in most children. And although we don't encourage it by giving prizes or first place and things like that, it's there. We don't discourage it. We don't encourage it because I think competitiveness is a good thing. I think it's one of those things that you need to learn to have balance with. So you can use it to make yourself a better person. If you don't have any competitiveness, I think you kind of slow down.
Your wheels are spinning, Doctor. What do you want to add?
So let's ask Jeff Bezos if he's competitive. Yeah, he is. Jeff Bezos is unbelievably competitive. He attributes some of his success with Amazon to his Montessori background.
And
let's ask the Google guys if they're competitive. Yeah, they're competitive too. Yeah, it turns out. And let's look at the authors of the Innovator's DNA, a kind of a business book that was published about 2 years ago, who identified an overrepresentation of Montessori in the background of executives who have been identified as innovative entrepreneurs. Were those people playing to win? Of course they were, yeah. Yeah, so I can understand why people would say, yeah, but you know, they're not in fierce competition for scarce resources, or they're not playing a zero-sum game in that environment. But you know, if you play a zero-sum game at the office, you may or might not get ahead doing that. So yeah, I understand why people would ask that question, and it's just like, oh man, you know, where do you even start? Where do you even start? It's a superficial interpretation of, oh, I get it. So I don't know, let's make an environment where like the person who scores lowest gets killed, you know, let's do that, okay? Would they be fighting a little bit? Would they be working a little bit harder? Well, that's a competitive environment. You know, I understand why people ask that, but it's like, oh man, where do you even begin?
You know, the competition too is built within the materials. If you're using some piece of material and you see the fellow next to you using the next piece, and they all know what the next piece is, they can't wait to get there. So they work through this first piece so that they can get to that second piece. Now that's a natural competitiveness, good competitiveness, I think. And yeah, I agree with what you're saying.
I'm going to give the governor the opportunity to respond to any of that if he chooses to, and then get ready because I'm going to surrender the floor to all of you, and for about 15 minutes you'll have the opportunity to pose questions, and then we'll move on to breaking bread. Governor, any thoughts that you wanted to share with what Gerry had to say?
I just want to ask Gerry a question that's always been on my mind. Gerry, do you think there's value to, with a child, and you could do this K1, 2, or you could do it 3, 4, 5-year-old, having a teacher stay with a child for more than 1 year?
I think it's great. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would love to see our schools structured so that at least spend 3 years, particularly at the early developmental stage. Now, what's the problem with that? Anybody? What's the problem with that?
You might get somebody you don't like.
Well, no, not that. It costs money. It's more expensive. You'd have to have more teachers on hand to be able to do that. But I think I think that nurturing relationship. I remember when Jesse was going through Penn Charter. You know, there was one teacher that he had, I think as a second grader, he would have run through a wall for it. And I thought, it's a shame that he has to leave that teacher. You know, third grade is a very important grade. It's a shame that she can't go with him. And I would love to see a system like that.
You know, it's funny you say that because I never thought about the significance of it. I went K through 12 in the Central Bucks Public Schools in Doylestown, and I had Mrs. Shannon for both both first and second grade.
Interesting.
And I had wonderful teachers. She taught me to read. And if you were to say to me, okay, who was really special, she'd be at the top of my list.
Interesting.
And I just
Was
by
that
quirk.
common at Central Bucks?
No, it wasn't. I think it was just through
Quirk?
happenstance that I was in that position.
Interesting.
Hey, what a great panel. Thank all three of our special guests.
And by the way, you cannot be a good mayor. I don't care if you're the greatest economic development whiz in the world, but you cannot be a good mayor unless you deal with rec centers and potholes and snow removal. And those are the things that are just as important with being a good mayor as job creation. And I did that, and I think I did it well, and I served well. But if I go back into public life, I want to have an impact on those issues, which I think can not only help Philadelphia, but help people all over. You know, I go to a lot of cities. I give a lot of speeches for nonprofits, for myself, and I see the same challenges in other cities that we're facing here. And it breaks your heart. It breaks your heart. I see an American infrastructure, greatest country in the world. 20 years ago, we ranked #1 in the World Economic Forum in the quality and competitiveness of our infrastructure. We now rank 16th, behind countries like Iceland and Albania. 16th. Most of the water mains in the city of Philadelphia, the 5th largest city in America, were laid in the 19th century. Think about that. In the 1800s. I don't know if you saw on television last winter when we had that terrible stretch of cold weather. There was a water main break at the new shopping center in East Falls, Fox Street. It flooded 4 or 5 stores. It was a 58-foot wide sinkhole, and the pipes were laid in 1878. In 1878. Who are we kidding? Who are we kidding? Unless we spend money repairing and revitalizing and building out our infrastructure, we're cooked as an economic power, as well as we're going to see more and more bridges collapse, more and more pipelines burst, things that we don't want to see happen. But yet you won't. Michael, there are 2 senators, Corker of Tennessee, a Republican, and Murphy of Connecticut, a Democrat, sponsored a bill to raise the gas tax 12 cents a gallon over 2 or 3 years and index it to inflation. They got 1 other senator out of 100 to sign on to the bill. 1 other senator. Because we have created in Washington this anti-government, anti-spending. People are afraid, they're petrified. If it was a secret ballot, they'd get 85 senators for raising the gas tax. And by the way, if they raised the gas tax, the average American would spend $114 more a year. Right now, because of inadequate roads and potholes and sinkholes, we spend about, in congestion, losing gasoline, it costs us about, according to a study, about $800 a year. So we're losing $700 a year. Try to convince people of that. Try to get politicians with the heart to convince people of that. So those are the issues that I want to deal with. And again, if we were Detroit, if we were in that bad shape, I'm enough of a Philadelphian that I would run, but I don't think we're Detroit. Population is growing in the city. Real estate values are going up. Crime is not great, but is sort of stabilized. I don't need to ride to the rescue. They don't need me.
It's a serious answer. We appreciate that. I'm going to just add one thing because I was thinking about this recently, and this is unprecedented, and I can't think of anybody else for whom this would have taken place. On your last day in office, it was essentially office hours, an open house where people stood up. I brought my wife and our kids to do it, to thank you. And all day long in City Hall, and you got a picture. To thank you for the job that you had done, which is really extraordinary. So reconsider. Okay. Next question. Who has it?
Well, the first day was cleaning up the bathrooms, as I recall.
Yes.
That's right.
And they're basically, ever since, they've been passable. Not Four Seasons quality, but passable.
So the question is about the future of No Child Left Behind, how you see that from the political side. And Michael and the governor, if you could address that.
Well, it was interesting. Gerry and the doctor talked about the problems with testing. And there are problems with testing, particularly if we build our total reliance on test scores. But testing has a place because it's very hard to have accountability. And without accountability, you can't give a good product to the kids. If the kids are going to a bad school and we don't know it's an underperforming school, we can't take steps to remedy it. So you have to have some testing. But performance should be not just based on a test score. It should be based on how many kids actually graduate, how many kids drop out, how many kids go on to college, how many kids maintain college without dropping out, what's the attendance record of the kids in the school, what's the level of absenteeism. There's so many things that a school should be judged on. Do they have music and art, and have they produced kids with any special talents? There's so many factors that go into it. But so I think No Child Left Behind will be reinstituted. I think the problem with No Child Left Behind was too much reliance on the test. And secondly, it never gave the states and the school districts adequate funding to comply with all the things that was needed. Interestingly, President Bush stood with Ted Kennedy, Democrat, liberal lion. Ted Kennedy was the main sponsor of No Child Left Behind, and it was funded here. And that funding would have been adequate to do some of the things that would have made No Child Left Behind a more positive bill. When the president gave the tax cut, the funding for No Child Left Behind dropped through the floor. And we never had funding to make it work. But you've got to have some form of accountability, and testing should play a role. It shouldn't be dispositive, but it should play a role.
This is a question for Gerry and Dr. Hughes. Do you see a growth in Montessori schools throughout the country? And do you see it as a choice, quote unquote, as a possibility for charter schools? Do you see any growth in that area as well for Montessori schools?
You want to say something about that? Or?
Well, I'll let you start because I'm not too...
Okay, so is there growth in Montessori? Yeah, I think that the world has caught up with Montessori, and I want to really emphasize the growth internationally as well. In fact, China is on fire for Montessori. They're on fire for Montessori. It's like the Wild West. Any of us, seriously, you want to go make some money? Let's go open a Montessori school in China. We could do it today. We could get in place tomorrow, and we'd be full. China's on fire for Montessori. Second thing, is it an option for charter schools? It certainly is. Although again, the fact I personally feel that the charter movement is sort of incomplete because the governor rightly notes that it's important that there be accountability. No question about that. There needs to be accountability. But they're all vulnerable to this, nervousness about how we're going to do on the tests. They'll do fine on the tests, or maybe they will do fine after a couple of years of getting their game together. I feel like the charters, in a sense, offer sort of a false diversity of educational opportunity, because you can do whatever you want as long as you're doing something that looks an awful lot like regular school. That might not be a particularly nuanced view, but it seems to me that I would like to see something that I would consider real diversity of educational opportunity. And charters don't seem, at least in my experience, to provide that. You can do Montessori, but you still have too many constraints to do Montessori as well as Montessori can be done. I guess that's the main point. You can't do world-class Montessori, or it's an uphill battle. And then just like the governor talks about how when you don't have good continuity of leadership, it's the same thing in school districts. I mean, literally, a new superintendent can roll in and with the stroke of a pen wipe out 20 years of world-class Montessori, just like that, because it doesn't fit, because I don't get it, and if I don't get it, it can't be for real, it can't be good, and it's out. And that happens like that. That happened. My God, there's been some heartbreaking examples where simply the leadership change has led to the elimination of Montessori. You want to add something to that, Gerry?
I'm not too familiar with too many charter schools with Montessori. I do know they exist, and I have spoken to some teachers, and they validate what you're saying. It's pretty hard to deliver the full program as it should be delivered because of all the layers of bureaucracy on top of it. So
I'll say one more thing about that, then we can move on.
Yeah.
The trouble, look, for God's sake, if anybody knows how to do education well, to build better brains, to launch children who have a sense of themselves, who know what they care about, who know what they're here on this planet to do, it's Montessori. And so, for God's sake, if only the Montessorians could be left alone to do what they do better than anyone in human history has done, it'd be great. But the fact is we can't leave them alone. We don't have a carve-out to do Montessori the way Montessori really needs to be done. It's a big problem, and in fact, it's a big problem internationally as well. There are some countries in the world where just because of the increasing legislative burden or the, it's all based upon wanting to make sure that nobody wrecks the children, right? So they get more and more prescriptive about what you're able to do, particularly in early childhood environment, that they can legislate the ability to do Montessori right out of existence. And that's a problem that I don't know how to solve, but it's something that's going to plague us for quite a long time.
Well, currently there's a bit of a revolution in higher education, and a lot of colleges are considering and have already gotten rid of the requirement for these tests. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping that maybe from the top down we'll reach together from the bottom up. But do you have any comments on that and how we might use that to our advantage? And we still have to have
accountability.
The accountability that you discussed. I think that's true, but how does that kind of meld together in a positive way?
Who do you want to answer that?
Anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me say, you're talking about the SAT tests, and some of the colleges are going off the SAT test. The problem with that is you'd have to have a very focused and robust interview process. Because let's say you have 2 applicants for 1 spot in your college, and one was a straight A student at the ABC school, and the other was a B- student at the CDE school. Well, if you don't have SATs, and you don't have a robust interview process, you'd have to assume that you're going to take the straight A student from the ABC school. Well, it may well be that the ABC school has standards which are woefully low, and the CDE school has standards that are very high, and the student who's the B- student at the CDE school is far more ready for your university than this straight A student at the ABC school. And the SAT tests are a little bit of a leveler because everyone takes them. I guess now you can take the ACTs or the SATs, but everyone takes some sort of standardized test so you can sort of get an idea, what the parity is among the schools and what it means to get a straight A in one school and what it means to be a B- student at another school. I'll tell you one quick story. A friend of mine came in and said, would you try to help my daughter get into Penn? And I do this all the time, particularly at Penn, which is my alma mater. And she came in, she went to, not Levittown, Neshaminy High. 750 students in her senior class. She was number 1. She was student government president. She had about 680 on her boards. That's 680 average on her 3 boards. And she was waitlisted at Penn. So I called up the dean, who was a friend of mine, and I said, Dean, do you realize what you're saying if you don't take this young woman? You're saying that no one from the Chamonix High School should ever bother to fill out an application for Penn. Because where are you going to get someone who was an athlete, number 1 in her class, straight A student, 4.0, AP courses, 680 on the boards, editor of the school newspaper? You can't do that. But you need some, what would be the answer if you did away with the SAT tests? How would you gauge, if you're a college, which student to take and which student not to take?
Well, I can tell you what the University of Chicago Director of Admissions said when he came to visit my child's high school. My daughter's a junior. And your points are well taken about, like, there's got to be some kind of universal standard. Fair enough. There's a role for this stuff. Maybe the role is as a cut score, you know what I mean? Right. Like, we're a top grade school, so we consider, we've got a minimum 650, let's say, So we don't look at your application unless you got 650. But if you got 650, we'll look at your application. What he said, and that's not what he said about University of Chicago, but if you're going to have test scores, okay, let's just say, have it be a cut score. And then he talked a lot about the increasing interest in interestingness of applicants. And in fact, he said some interesting things, like, there's a whole industry in preparing college applications, right? There are consultants who do that. Well, this isn't lost on the admissions people, right? Okay? And so, not only do you have, hundreds, maybe thousands of valedictorians not get accepted to Harvard, but you've got hundreds and maybe thousands of applications that look startlingly similar, even down to including the extra service projects that, by the way, weren't done for the reciprocal learning that comes from participating in service projects. It was come to burnish the resume. Yeah, yeah. Well, it's not lost on them. They know that. And I read 1,000 essays that have that just right sort of polish to them, right? And they said, look, we just are interested in people who have their own voice. People who have their own voice. That's Montessori, man. Yeah, there's just no escaping that. So yeah, okay, let's do some kind of, I mean, to be fair, there are more academically rigorous, more intellectually rigorous programs, and it's not fair to anybody to have a student who's really unprepared for that, who isn't cut out for that.
And that's an interesting point the doctor made. I remember when Jesse went on from Montessori to Penn, and I remember his school started the first week in September. I remember talking to Jesse middle of October, and I said, how are your studies going? He said, Dad, it's really tough. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, at Penn Charter, and this is Penn Charter. He said, at Penn Charter, there was always half of the class that was the bottom of the curve. You started off knowing that there were half of your class below you. At Penn, there is no bottom of the curve.
Yeah. Yeah, right on. Yeah.
Final question before we break.
I guess it's me. Over here.
Oh, there he is.
This question goes to Dr. Hughes, I think more than the others, but you feel free to answer. You've been speaking a lot about teaching to the test, and it's kind of, I don't know if it's obvious, but perhaps the tests are not correctly calibrated. If you were to make up your own test, what would be the things that you would be asking?
That's a great question.
Achievement tests are more or less essentially disguised IQ tests. Okay, assessment of intellectual ability is a mature science. Assessment of academic knowledge is a mature science. If it were up to me, I would say, hey, look, man, there's benchmarking. We got to make sure that when it's all said and done, that nobody with a profound reading disability managed to escape through high school without ever learning how to read. So my view is that there's a kind of a diagnostic benchmarking role in testing. I like some of the things that you mentioned earlier about what else matters. I just turned 52 like last week, and it was a different world when I was in school. Most of you people are probably in your 30s or maybe even in your 20s. You don't know how different it was. From the looks of it, you're all in your 20s. Yeah. The room is dark. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. But you don't know how different it is compared to when I was a kid. And you start reading, I start reading some of the research on school has become a kind of a soul-crushing environment. It wasn't in my day, but it really is not what it used to be. And it's because of this teachers lose their jobs if students don't do well on these tests. So, okay, there's a role for assessment. My God, I'm a neuropsychologist. My whole life is assessment. This is what I do. I measure all these sorts of things. I wouldn't create a test. I would say that to gain access to privileged levels of academic, to gain access to privileged academic environments, like the highest end, there's got to be some way. And that technology is mature. Frankly, we could give everyone an IQ test, which is kind of what we're doing anyway. Okay, let's just say this is for the people who are in the top 3%. Sorry. If we had fairness across education, if we did a Finland sort of approach to higher ed, no one would care that they weren't in the top 3%. They would say, well, there's this other kind of program that is also extraordinary, and that's more my cup of tea.
And you weren't talking about getting into college. You were talking about more of how we test the accountability.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. But okay, so you want to say something about that?
I was going to say something about college. Parents are obsessed with getting their kids into Penn or Harvard or whatever. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Your kids can get a great education at Boston University. They can get a great education at Northeastern. They can get a great education at St. Joe. It doesn't matter. It may matter for the first job, but it doesn't matter after that. Yeah, it's like I used to say, if your lawyer went to Harvard Law School but you got the death penalty, you don't care very much. Just doesn't matter. Let your kid have fun, enjoy the educational process, and let them go to a place where they can absorb all the good things about education. And they exist in almost every campus.
And to continue with that, we would there's a wider scope of things that need to be understood. Like, okay, let's do benchmark testing. Let's make sure no one has escaped with a significant learning disability, and let's do also some things that are very much around evaluation of the learning environment. You know, look, what does Sir Ken Robinson say? Not every child is born to be a scholar, but every child is born to be something, right? Okay, and there's an awful lot known about the kind of I guess what they call in the general category developmental environments. Okay, a developmental environment is one where people get to sort of figure out what they're born to do, and there are characteristics of that that are understood, that are identified, that you wouldn't surprise Gerry, look an awful lot like Montessori environments. Okay, so we should say, yeah, there's benchmarking, and of course in Montessori too, by the way, especially in 3 to 6. There's continuous assessment going on there. You don't need to test to know if a child has phonological awareness, because the materials themselves, the child's progression through the materials, tell you everything you need to know about how they're doing, progressing in their sort of academic skills. But what's missing is things like saying, well, let's talk about this environment, and do you have a rich program, and there's a rich diversity of opportunity for experience in this program, and let's have people sit in that classroom and say, yeah, it's a good vibe here, there's a good buzz here. This feels like the kind of place that I'd like my kid to go. You know, I'll bet every one of you who did a classroom visit before you came to Gladwyne, every one of you who did a classroom visit before you came here thought,
everyone.
It must be everyone, yeah. If it's not everyone, it's nearly everyone. It's like, must have said, wow, man, this feels good. I want a piece of this for my kid. That is actually, that's observable, and there are elements that led to that actually are documentable and quantifiable. We could actually, qualify the degree to which this is a world-class Montessori environment, and 2, the degree to which it really is things that we know that characterize a developmental environment.
And how would you grade it, to go back to the accountability for elementary schools, middle schools, whatever, how would you grade a middle school where the test scores were slightly below average, but there was almost no absenteeism, and virtually no child got involved in the juvenile justice system, whereas the average score for a middle school in that city, 12%, 15% got involved with the juvenile justice system. How's that school doing?
And let's go even further, actually. Let's look at how some of these no excuses schools, you know what we're talking about, like KIPP and things like that. Okay, they blow the doors off of standardized testing, and then those children end up going to college, and they fall on their faces because they were in a test score machine the whole time that they were there. You guys know KIPP, right?
Sure.
Okay, highly successful. Yeah, highly successful in producing test scores, but they themselves will acknowledge that they are falling far short of their 75% college completion goal. Last I saw, and it's maybe a couple of years old, 33%. I mean, these are kids who are, blowing the doors off of testing in junior high school and high school. In fact, when they started, they were doing junior high, and all these disadvantaged children ended up blowing the doors off the test, getting scholarship access to privileged high school opportunities, did well there, and then they got to college and they cratered because they didn't have any. You would think that it's all you need, right? They got everything they need. But what they didn't get is the stuff that comes automatically with Montessori, like good self-regulation, a sense of one's own self, abstract problem-solving ability, the capacity to walk into a situation, figure out what needs to be done, and do it. Because they didn't need to do any of that stuff. They were in a highly structured, highly teacher-directed environment. And, school 10 hours a day, school on Saturdays, school in the summers. Hey, look, you know what? At some point, you're going to start getting kind of good at school because you're not doing much of anything else, okay? So yeah, you increase the amount of time in school by like 70%. Sure enough, there's an identifiable impact on test scores.
But how would you say, you asked the question, how would you say the principal of that middle school is doing? Mediocre to slightly under test scores, but no absenteeism, and almost none of the kids getting involved in the juvenile justice system. Probably, but in real life, how's he doing? He's doing great. He's turning out. He's turning out citizens.
Yeah.
He's turning out citizens. And by the way, maybe a lot of those kids were never destined for college necessarily, but they can have tremendously productive careers doing other stuff. That's another thing. Parents everywhere, not just here in the main line, parents everywhere want to jam their kids into college, whether it fits or not. There are some kids, there are plenty of college graduates who don't have jobs 6 months out of school. And you pick up the Inquirer and look at the ads for auto mechanics.
Yeah. or plumbers or pipe fitters.
who make $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year as 23-year-olds.
Mike Bloomberg just made that point this week, same point that you're making now. We have to wrap up. What a great conversation. Thank our panelists, and thank you for being here. Thank you, Michael. Thank you.